Hello, it's Phillip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London. Today I'm looking at a book which has come to us from LexisNexis and Jordan Publishing. It's an important book and one that I think is very relevant to people involved in welfare law. Generally, this is about tenants' rights of first refusal. It's now the third edition. It's been written by Anthony Radevsky and Wayne Clark. As I say, the book has now come to us from Jordan's, and it's an important book. Elizabeth and I wrote the review. She's done most of the work on it. It's a clear and authoritative perspective on the Landlord and Tenant Act 1987. It's an important piece of legislation at the moment. We are in 2017. I'm recording this in the summer of 2017. You see how many years have gone by since 1987. A long time. And you can see in that time there have been a lot of changes. Now, there's a very interesting picture on the front cover of the book of a tower block with cladding, I think, in places. I'm recording this after Grenfell Tower and what happened in that particular tower block. I think this is an important book to bear in mind because we're looking at some very, very important subjects which are going to face all of us in the 21st century. That's the front anyway. There is the spine. Then on the back, you've got some basic information about what's in the book itself. Not a great deal of information. You can see it's from LexisNexis and it's also available as an ebook too. And you can get the ebook information from www.jordanpublishing.co.uk. The book itself is a hardback and it runs to 342 pages. The index at the back is by paragraph numbering. So it's not by page numbering, it's paragraph numbering. It's quite a detailed index, which I think is very helpful. You can see from that. References are to paragraph numbers. You see, it tells you that. At least it tells you that. Sometimes it don't. You've got to work it out for yourself. There we go. You see that information. Then you've got the book itself here. Practice Guidance 27, the leasehold reform legislation, and so forth. The tribunal procedure is given there, and so forth. Let's go to the front of the book. There's the front page there. Then after that you can see some information. That's information from Lexis. Then there's a preface by the two authors, and they say that the law is stated as of 14th of March 2017. So I'm recording this a few months down the line. It's nearly 9 years since the second edition, so a lot of time has passed. There's the contents, but they've updated everything, which I think is very helpful. You can see the various chapter headings as we run through. All the usual suspects are there. There are a total of 12 chapters and then all the appendices at the back. The appendices start at page 167. So can I just say that when you get to that, you can see that it's almost half the book is the appendices themselves, and that's notices under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1987 and so on, all the way through. But the front of the book, as I say, after the content section, you've got a lot of case law, which again is of use to us. Then you've got the table of cases, again of importance. Then you have SIs there, and then you get straight into the chapter. You can see the structure. There's a standard heading. Then you've got paragraph numbering there, and then you've got footnotes at the bottom with all of the justifications for what's being said and more detailed reading for referencing and so on. It's a very erudite book. It's very much a lawyer's book. I think it's a very important book if you ever get problems concerning aspects of the residential tenant's right of first refusal under this piece of legislation. Because as I found certainly in the general election 2017, and I'm sure it's going to, and the most recent elections around that time and the year before, the issue itself of housing, excuse me, and the whole issue of accommodation is a big one, especially in London. It's a big problem because there just is not the housing stock available. And of course this subject in itself is a very important one because it bestows rights on people, and these rights are very important ones which have been obviously given by Parliament itself. And when you note the date 1987, you can see that we're going back a long way. We're going back to certainly Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister, when there were some very substantial pieces of legislation, which I certainly was involved in with other people at that time, which I think were of lasting importance to what I call welfare law, which encompasses a very wide range of what I do, which is possession, actions, housing, benefits, and family law, in essence, everything to do with the family and so forth. Anyway, what is the book about? Well, it's about this. If you're a lawyer involved in or embroiled in a number of landlord and tenant matters, then this is the book for you, because it can be relied upon to guide you through the complexities and intricacies of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1987. That is what the book's all about. Thankfully, it's just been published again by LexisNexis in a new edition. And I say I haven't been involved in that many cases in this particular area of law myself, but certainly I think this is an excellent book to go with a number of other of the standard definitive texts in this area. We're reminded here that the rights of first refusal actually favours certain tenants of certain kinds of properties, mainly mansion blocks, in that if the landlord wishes to sell his property, he's required to offer it to his tenants first, giving them first refusal. Certainly had a lot of those, rather than to a third party. Obviously, people have come to me basically with advice, not so much about laws, more saying, well, what should I help? What should I do? He's decided he's going to sell the freehold, and do you think I've got the money? Scratch your head. Have I got enough money? You know, that sort of thing. So you can see why they may want to come and see lawyers quite quickly, and this book will assist. Initially, of course, notice has got to be served, of course, by the landlord, and the disposal made in accordance with the statutory requirements. Not going into any of that. It's all covered here, and of course in the other main practice books that you may wish to see, the Landlord and Tenant, loose lease and everything else. Now, since the previous edition of this book came out in 2008, decisions have emerged on several important cases in this area, and of course there have been a number of important legislative developments as well, of which this new edition takes account. And for a number of reasons, most of them good, the 87 Act has been referred to by the judiciary as the most criticised piece of legislation ever. Now, I've made a comment earlier about the fact that we had a lot of legislation, but you're going to find out why this piece of legislation has been subject, as one or two others, being rushed through and being completely and utterly looked at in the wrong way. And I'm afraid it is a sad fact of life in the British Parliament that in recent decades there have been quite a few pieces of legislation that really have not been properly scrutinised, because they've all been too busy counting their expense forms and everything else, when in fact the reality has been that what started off as very sensible pieces of legislation have been mucked about, and we end up then, because of the people who've been making the decisions line by line on what we've got, they've made decisions and produced something which becomes a proper turkey. Now, I'm not going to criticise the Tory or the Labour parties in particular as governments for this, because I think everybody's responsible to a certain extent, but I would like to see a little bit more thinking coming into some of this legislation. The academic world have been saying that in terms of both law and politics sectors at the universities for a long time, and I certainly agree with it, that we've got to raise the standards a bit. Now here we've got two practicing barristers, that's the authors Anthony Radevsky and Wayne Clark from Falcon Chambers in London. They're both specialists in this area of law, and they're well qualified to provide valuable perspectives on this said piece of legislation, offering first of all a number of insights into its historic background and why we've got where we've got to. Because I will say, in defence of the Thatcher government in particular, that there were a lot of attempts to try and update our legislation by her three administrations and then John Major's, obviously the back end of Thatcher and then his own main administration, against a lot of other problems that were going on at the time. And also, I have to say, one of the problems too is that I think quite a large number of Conservative MPs did not come from a background where they had really a great deal of understanding of what some of these people, the ordinary people involved in these problems, were actually facing and suffering. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind, because at the end of the day, members of Parliament in the Commons certainly should be reflecting what we've actually got to face as the members of the public. It's not what we've really got, but at least that's an ideal. Let me go back to the book, however. The Act, they say, this is the authors say, was rushed through Parliament before the 1987 general election. That, if you remember, was the last election Thatcher fought, and she got a reasonably good majority. It was by a government keen to be seen tackling the well-publicised problems of lessees in large mansion blocks, mainly in key constituencies in central London. Yes, except that. These, note, were private premises. We're not talking about social housing. We're not talking here about local government organisations. The Act came into force unamended and as such inspired even more criticisms, ill-drafted, complicated and confused. Well, it's not the only one, so both Radevsky and Clark can rest assured, bearing in mind what they say, that this is not a sole piece of legislation that falls into this category. I'm not going to mention all the others because I'm sure you know about them. But the fact is that we've got what we've got. And the likelihood of getting any changes initially 30 years on is pretty limited, I'd have thought, at the moment. However, the Act certainly reveals itself as containing all kinds of oddities, of which, for sake of brevity, we shall name only two. One is it doesn't define the word building, possibly because there are all kinds of buildings. Bad point. Well, good point for us. Bad point for the parliamentarians. And second, it doesn't define internal. Well, it doesn't really help us, does it? You see what the problems are. Your basic definitions are not even being looked at properly. The last can get awkward if a matter contains balconies or roof terraces. Now, I'm not a pedant, and I don't like people suggesting that we are getting into so much minute detail, but some of these things are really quite important points to bear in mind, especially when you're dealing with mansion blocks in London which are worth a great deal of money. But never mind all that. The fact remains, in our view, and certainly I think that of many people, that the 1987 Act remains a very significant and mighty piece of legislation, and complicated. But a lot of them pieces have been like this, unfortunately. Although the Act may be, it's clearly analysed, of course, although it's complicated in plain English, of taking into account the often disparate viewpoints of both landlords and tenants, thus prioritising the need for objectivity in this area of law. What does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means in the reality of it all, and that is that there was the balance being sought to be achieved between landlords and tenants, where the landlord is in a stronger position than the tenant. The landlord may be perceived to be in the sort of Tory voting area, and the tenant might be in the Labour or Lib Dem area. You see how it becomes political very quickly. But the problem is you need to have the objectivity, because you have to have a balance with, again, in this case, the right of a tenant to have the first bite at the cherry when it comes to a landlord deciding to flog off his freehold interest. Now that's basically where we are with it. It's just a shame that, again, Parliament can't get its act together. But that has been a problem, in my opinion, for decades, and it doesn't look like it's going to change at the moment until something very serious happens in the future. The only saving grace, and I'm going to say this because I know people won't like it, is the fact that the House of Lords, if it can get its hands on some of these pieces of legislation, can try, especially if they're introduced in the Lords, they can try and make sure that the sense of the content of the clauses in the bill are properly followed through into the sections in the Acts of Parliament. That doesn't happen because the Commons, and they all get themselves involved in it and produce a real mishmash of rubbish. And that's unfortunately what does happen with some of this legislation. Anyway, we've discussed what the content of the Act is and what's happened. This book helps, I think, in the way of unravelling a lot of the information that you may be seeking. So let me conclude by saying, in these and so many other areas of fascinating confusion, where Parliament has produced legislation which is not up to it, putting it bluntly. This book very fortunately provides ample and useful commentary as well as a wealth of research resources containing extensive appendices, which is half the book basically, and tables of cases, statutes and statutory instruments. It's not surprising then that this reliable and authoritative volume, now in a third edition, has come to be considered an essential purchase for the truly tenacious practitioner's professional library. And I think it does actually help when you've got this book, if you've got a problem specifically about this area of law. It could be an area that becomes more predominant as the housing stock perhaps continues to be so small. I mean, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan's been in power for some time, hasn't built one single house. So you can see what the problem is in the period of time that he's been the elected Mayor of London. So you can see, just as one example, the sort of difficulties that we as the public are facing. And it's not helped, of course, if they produce rushed legislation which is more emotional than based upon thought and good practice. The data publication is cited at 2017. As I say, the law itself is cited according to the authors, I think, at the 14th of March 2017. This is the book itself. You can see the way they've produced. We're talking here about information notices. This is the notice that has to be produced right at the beginning by the landlord, triggering the time for service purchase notices, encumbrances on the land, purchase notices here. Then we've got termination of rights against a purchaser or a subsequent purchaser and so on. Procedure and appeals. So you've got basically everything that you should be looking for, and then you've got just after that, that's the end of it, prospective purchasers, section 18. Then after that you've got the appendices themselves. It's a good book, and I'm very grateful to Falk and Chambers and Lexis for continuing to publish this particular work. I think it's an important one at a time when we're still having really quite low quality people in Parliament producing rubbish legislation, which unfortunately is the case, and it doesn't matter what party they're from. The fact is they've got to get a grip, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. However, we've got these excellent professionals who can guide you and us through these minefields. So thank you very much to all concerned. Bye-bye.